certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
The court was told today it's not impossible that Bradley Edwards' DNA ended up under Ciara Glennon's fingernail through contamination. Hello, thanks for joining us for day 57 of Claremont in Conversation. You're with Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clarke and defence lawyer Damien Cripps. Now, Tim, this to me was a surprising and I think an unexpected admission today.
Yeah, it was a little bit. So put it into context. Mr. Egan had been on the stand for this is his fifth day of giving evidence, but this was the last day, and Mr. Jovich has spent most half of that cross-examining him, and today he got to the culmination, the climax of his cross-examination, and it really got to the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of it, in terms of asking Mr. Egan whether he thought it was possible, probable, likely or unlikely that this supposed contamination, this theorised contamination of Ciara's fingernail with Mr. Edwards' DNA could have happened. And when he was asked this question, Mr. Egan said, well, it is not impossible, but he put a caveat on that and say because impossible is a word we absolutely very rarely use in science, because we don't like to think things are impossible in science because we're always looking for the next level of research or whatever it might be. And then on the back of that, he did say unlikely, highly unlikely, very unlikely, many times after that, but he couldn't say it's impossible. And that was on the back of several highly unlikely events that Mr. Jovich had actually pointed him to that had happened in the PathWest lab in terms of cross-contamination and things like that. So as a headline, people might see it on the website and see it's not impossible and think, oh, wow, well, did it actually happen? Well, if you broke it down into odds, it would be hundreds of thousands to one, I would think. But Mr. Jovich has also gone to other occasions when those odds were similar, but it did actually occur.
Can you talk us through why Scott Egan said it was unlikely?
Well, so, yeah, quick recap. We all know now that the defence theory or the defence postulation is that Ciara's DNA, which was found, Mr. Edwards' DNA, which was found on Ciara's fingernails in 2008, got there through a contamination event of some sort in the lab. But we've really drilled down as far as we possibly could in the last 3 or 4 days as to all the possible scenarios as to how that happened. And it comes down to windows and it comes down to dates, basically. And the dates that are important are when Mr. Edwards' DNA was actually extracted and then stored in the lab in 1996. So this is from an intimate swab from the Karrakatta victim, was actually taken in 95, but it took a year for DNA to be extracted. So we're looking at February 1996. And then we jump forward to April 1997, which we know was when Ciara's body was discovered, her post-mortem was done, and those fingernail samples were taken. And it's that gap, the 13-month gap between Mr. Edwards' sample being worked on on that bench, the DNA extraction bench, and then those fingernails being taken, snipped, and then stored in the lab, the same lab, 13 months later. And that's the gap that the prosecution have pointed to over and over again in the last few days, saying, well, what are the chances that something 13 months down the track could possibly be contaminated, because they've also produced graphics to show that at no other time were either of those extracts out of the box, the shelf, the freezer, the fridge, and on the same bench. So that it's that window of opportunity that they say makes it hugely unlikely, because the main other contamination event that Mr. Jovich has pointed to is this unrelated victim and her DNA getting onto a sample from Jane's crime scene the gap there between those two processes taking place in the lab was 4 or 5 days, with a weekend in between. So, and they drilled down very deeply into how that could possibly have happened today, but the gap was significantly shorter, the extraction processes, and you could possibly see how that could happen. Even Mr. Egan said, well, we think this is how, but we can't pinpoint exactly how. But those days were approximate, whereas the Karrakatta samples and the Glennon samples were so far apart, and so much would have happened on that bench in that time frame in between that the prosecution say, well, look, the chances are infinitesimal that this contamination could have happened.
Damien, when you hear this, 13 months between the gaps, between when the contamination could have happened. So we're hearing a forensic scientist say, look, it's not impossible, because we don't like to use the word impossible, but it's highly unlikely. When you mull that over, what do you make of that?
Well, I start to look for other things. When I say other things, I start, if I was working on the case, which I'm not, if I was working on the case, that would probably be a point where I would say, okay, that is what it is. There's not much more that we can do with that. Let's move on to whatever the next thing is. The reason I say that, Natalie, is because it would be extremely laborious in anyone's mind, even the most astute mind, to sit down and say, okay, well, let's go through this minute by minute, second by second, and try to establish how a contamination could have happened. And I think Mr. Egan's covered off on it probably the best that anyone could. It's not impossible. But it's highly unlikely. I think that's the best way to let it rest.
Yeah. And Tim, when Carmel Barbagallo talked to Scott Egan again after he'd been cross-examined, was there anything she could shed light on in terms of what could have happened in that 13-month gap there?
Well, the only thing she did point to, and this is a re-examination after the cross-examination, and it consisted of one question, which was how many times would that bench, that lab, that area have been cleaned in between the Edwards sample and the Glennon sample being out? And Mr. Egan had a sort of wry smile and a scratch of the head, and then sort of did the maths in his own head. He said, well, at least one DNA extraction per day in those 13 months, and then one amplification, which all our expert listeners now know is when the DNA sample is boosted chemically to hopefully get more sample, one of those a day, and a cleaning process would have taken place after each one of those. So at the very minimum, you take 2 of those, times it by 13 months. He says definitely hundreds, possibly thousands of times that bench would have been cleaned in between those two scientific processes taking place. And so again, that just puts another layer, I suppose, of improbability on the top of what the prosecution have been trying to say is fanciful and fantasy, and that, I mean, there's no getting away from that fact, because we've heard so many people say so many times how many cleaning things and efforts they go to, even back in 96, 97, back in the so-called primitive days of DNA. Even then they were taking those precautions, and obviously those processes have just improved over time. So and that was that. It was a sort of quite a sort of anticlimactic end to what's been a long stint for Mr. Egan. But it was one that really did put a full stop on what the prosecution have been trying to show the court.
And was Scott Egan able to explain any of the other contamination that we've discussed in these previous podcasts? Yeah,
he did try his very best. He's been faced with these embarrassing scenarios for the lab that we've discussed now for several days, and he did, but many times, as in the hypothetical Edwards Glennon contamination, many times he could just take a best guess of what might have happened, because they weren't video recorded. They have all the documents, they have who did what when, and then they can look at the possible window of opportunity when that contamination might have happened. The main one that they went to today was this unrelated victim sample that was found on the exhibit RH21, which is the piece of vegetation found at Jane's crime scene. They did really drill down into that because that was Mr. Jovich's best opportunity, really, or clearest opportunity to show that it doesn't have to be someone that comes into direct contact with an exhibit, i.e. a scientist, for a contamination to take place. And that we heard a lot today about tubes, about boxes, about consumables, and how the extraction process was done and how those tubes were chosen and stored. And his best guess, which is what it was a tube that was used on the Friday was somehow contaminated, or another tube close to it was contaminated and then used again the following week, and that was how the two pieces of biological matter came into contact. And once again, very honestly, he said that was a highly unlikely scenario because we tried everything we could. The boxes were kept separate. The tubes were supposed to be disposed of once they'd been used, but we have the EPG, the spikes on the graph that show us that this young lady's, it turns out she was a young lady, a victim of crime. DNA was there, and it couldn't possibly be her involved in the Rimmer crime because she was only 13 at the time that Jane went missing. So that ruled her out, obviously, as a person of interest. But what it did, it ruled her in when they did the test and tested the database and shown, well, she was actually in there because she was a victim, not because she had committed any crime.
And this was the first time we'd heard where this contamination had come from and who this DNA belonged to. And it just shows you now how far down they are digging into the detail, because these questions arise and we say, oh, I wonder whose DNA that was that contaminated the twig. And these are the answers that, as the court goes through the process, we're getting these answers.
Yeah, and it's what Damien's discussed and I've discussed many times. It's getting to the absolute truth, or the closest to the absolute truth that you can. And sometimes you've got to drill down into document after document after document, which is what Mr. Jovich has done, because he's trying to show that he's trying to create this reasonable doubt, and using these other contamination issues to cast doubt on PathWest in general. The scientists as a collective, I suppose, but what he hasn't been able to show is a specific event which might have led to Mr. Edwards' DNA being where it was found.
Damien, we heard some detail about just how many documents there are the other day with Scott Egan, and he talked about when he took over at PathWest that he had to go through 17, I think it was,
70
lever arch files of documents relating to this case. And it made me wonder, just how long does it take the lawyers to go through that volume of material?
Well, I think, Natalie, we talked about it earlier in the series, and that conversation comprised that it would depend on what your team was made up of. You know, like, I mean, Tim would be more familiar with what the prosecution team is made up of. And we did discuss previously that Mr. Jovich and his team might be somewhat smaller in size. What you would try to do is you would try to get, I would have thought, juniors to sort the files into categories, and then try to find out which of them rise to the top as the most important, and then you'd get your more senior people to start going through them to try to establish if there was anything in them. But ultimately, this is the problem, as for me as a lawyer, the problem that I always have is I always want to see everything. It's very difficult to say, I'll get a junior lawyer to have a look at this, or I'll get one of my colleagues to have a look at this. If you're going to be the lawyer that's going to be at the front running the cross-examination or leading the witness through their evidence, you need to know every single document that's in there. So if we're talking about a case that had 70, 80 lever arch files,
yeah.
I would have thought that the 2 or 3 most senior lawyers in either the prosecution or the defence would have been through all of those. So prepping for this and being in a position to actually cross-examine and get ready would have been a really, really extended period would have taken a really extended period of time. But not only that, one of the things I think people think is that when you're going through a trial, you can just you can say, okay, well, Tim Clarke's our next witness. He's coming up tomorrow. So what I'll do is I'll get back to the office tonight and I'll pull Tim Clarke's evidence out and I'll go through that and make sure I'm across it. But the problem with that is Clarke's evidence may have affected all of the witnesses that had gone before. So you need to know what Tim Clarke's evidence is going to be before you even start the trial. So if there's 70 or 80 lever arch files that have come from PathWest just in relation to this, they can't even commence entering a plea until they know what all of those files are made up of. And one of the other things that we talked about briefly the other day was when the court breaks early, like on days when the court breaks early and everyone gets the opportunity to go home early and go and have a bit of a break. And then I did think about that for a while, and what I thought would be really interesting for people to know is that a lawyer might head home on the Friday night having finished at 2 o'clock and have a glass of wine and some nice food and spend a bit of time with their family. But I would guarantee by about 10 or 11 o'clock that night, they would be starting, their fingers would be tapping, they'd be starting to think about it, and by Saturday morning they'd be back in the office, especially on a case like this, they'd be back in the office going, because the last thing you want to do is come back around for when court's recalled and go, you will anyway, even if you spend the whole weekend working. You'll get there on Monday morning, you'll be like, why didn't I just go through that? I wish I'd had more time to go through that. So even though there might be these breaks that are happening now, invariably all of those teams, including the judge and his team, will be working overtime.
I mean, the thing is, you can't afford to miss a thing, can you? When you're going through this paperwork, you can't afford to miss any of these details. And like you said, it's not something you can just hand over to the junior. Do you think Paul Jovich, really, the defence, prosecution, all of the people involved in this case, do they have much of a life right now? It sounds like probably not.
Well, Mr. Jovich manages to find a life, from what I can understand. But simultaneously, he manages to be across materials meticulously. He's one of those, I mean, look, I don't know him extremely well. I've known him through the industry, but what I've come to know of him, he's always meticulously across all the materials. But he does seem to have a life, from what I can tell. But I think that's important. If you're going to survive in an industry that's so demanding potentially like this, you need to be out of balance. You need to find a way. So I think that all of the people involved in this, whether it be racquetball, whether it be surfing, whether it be music or whatever it might be, they would find a way to just unwind and unpack the day somehow. So, I'm sure that they might not have as much of a life as they usually do, but they won't be able to get to the end if they don't have a life of some sort.
Yeah. Bit like you at the moment, Tim.
Yeah, a little bit now. Well, I mean, we did discuss that with Ali last week, and it does somewhat overtake everything if you let it, and so you need to build up a process, a personal process that you are able to compartmentalize it. I mean, obviously, we're just literally observing. We're not living it and in the court every day in terms of questioning very intelligent people on highly complex things. But we are trying to get our heads around it, and so we're getting a little taste of what it might be like, I suppose. But you can only admire everyone involved, including the judge, for their dedication in what is now nearly, day 60 will be upon us next week, and then all the weekends in between. I'm sure Damien's right that there's been work done behind the scenes. We know that because there was an issue that arose from a proofing session on a Saturday morning. So, I don't think there's been much time for the lawyers to get down a crown and have a meal or a bit of karaoke. I think it's just head in the books. Right into the end.
Yeah, they are doing an extraordinary job. Well, I guess that wraps up Scott Egan's testimony. When will we hear from Jonathan Whittaker?
Yes, so Monday, hopefully. He's coming in on, the last we heard, he's coming in from the UK on a flight on Saturday. But again, I stress coronavirus permitting, because we've just had a case this afternoon in Western Australia of a young lady who's got off a plane from the UK and has this virus. So touch wood, everything goes smoothly. If he does, then he will be on the witness stand for at least a day, possibly more. And then we have another witness from New Zealand. Ms. Vintner, who's another DNA expert, who will be talking about probabilities in terms of this 80 to 100 million to 1 against, that it wasn't anyone against other than Mr. Edwards. And then talking of time off to get the oneself ready for the next portion, that will be it for the DNA portion of the trial. And then we move on to fibres, but there will be a gap in between that. So Mr. Jovic will be able to get across all the things that his co-counsel Genevieve Cleary, who I understand has been doing a lot of the background work on the fibre evidence, so she's been getting all those ducks in a row. But then Mr. Jovic needs some time to get his head across it as the lead of the defence team. He's asked the judge for a little bit of time to allow that to happen, and he also said today that if he is allowed that time, then they might be able to narrow the issues, so that they will pick out, as Damien just said, prioritise things. We don't really need to go there, we don't really need to concentrate on that, so let's strip it out and just really hone in on what's going to be important, which is obviously of an advantage to everyone in terms of the length of the time of the trial, which is already mammoth. And the fibre evidence will go for many, many weeks, I'm sure, because we've got expert after expert after expert, and it's a very important cog in the prosecution case, because they say it links not only Ciara but Jane to Mr. Edwards directly, if they can show that these fibres came from his work pants and his work car.
Yep, still so much to go. We do have that break tomorrow, but Tim, you and I will be here recording a two-part
catch-up. As always, mate.
We will be here. So if you know someone who wants to jump in and doesn't want to listen to the past 55 days, then this two-parter will bring them straight up to date. So if you feel like you also need a refresher at this halfway mark, then tune in for these bonus episodes, which will drop tomorrow and over the weekend, so keep an ear out for those. Thank you both for your company today, and thanks for your company. We'll be back Monday for week 14 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the Trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.